Welcome to a special episode of the Lutheran History Podcast. As I've noted in my update for the show episode, we're doing things a little bit differently here on the Lutheran History Podcast. Now, we're still planning on doing regular interviews with historians, theologians who write on some aspect of Lutheran history. Part of the reason why I haven't been filling you up, at least in the month of June, with regular episodes is I had to turn my attention, my focus elsewhere. Stuff at the home front, stuff at church, and of course doing my continuing ed for 2 weeks down on the campus in St. Louis. So all those things were a higher priority than this podcast, as much as I like it, but it did cause a little bit of a hiccup as far as scheduling was concerned. So if you didn't catch it in the updates, we're planning on doing about one episode a month. I'm no longer going to hold myself to a strict twice a month kind of schedule. I just wanted to have a schedule that allowed me a little bit of freedom, flexibility, and I wanted to do something that was sustainable rather than force myself to do 2 episodes a month, go at a pace where realistically I probably couldn't do that justice. So here is a special episode which kind of ties into all of that. We're going to talk about Friedrich Wyneken and the Catechism. This was part of my final project for the class I took on the history of the Catechism. A lot of excellent things I learned from there. It kind of made me more well-rounded in my understanding and appreciation for catechesis, both in a historical sense and as a pastor in a very practical sense as well. So building on some studies I've already done, I decided to look at Friedrich Wyneken and the Catechism. Originally, I had planned on just presenting on Wyneken's Catechism, which he assembled himself. Then the project just grew and grew, and I really came to realize that the story of Wyneken could almost be told through the story of the catechisms that influenced his family, his ancestors, what influenced him as he grew up, as he was a catechumen, a student, learning the catechism all the way through the time when he made his own catechism, when he taught others, and the impact he left on future generations. So we're just going to kind of walk side by side Wyneken and his catechisms, and it should also give a pretty interesting picture of the transition between the church-state system in Germany, where your country had its own official catechism, where the superintendent of the churches was both an ecclesiastical and a government position. They determined what catechism was being used, but also we look at some of the popular piety that was going on, kind of like some underground catechesis that was going on when they didn't agree with what the state was officially endorsing. This also really helps us understand then that immigrant generation of every generation of Lutheran immigrants coming to the United States. They mixed and mingled with different Lutherans, maybe spoke the same language, but perhaps different regions of Germany, especially. Whose catechism are we going to use? Do we make our own? Do we just adopt one that was popular from before? We're not going to get into all of that in today's episode, but we'll give you at least one angle, one aspect of that broader transatlantic catechesis story from Lutheranism in the 19th century. So without further ado, let's get right into it and talk about Wyneken and the Catechism. Now, if you aren't familiar with Friedrich Wyneken, we've had a couple episodes where he's been highlighted, or at least been a major figure in the story. I did give a special episode which summarized my senior thesis as a seminary student. You can look in the archives of the podcast for that. But real briefly, Friedrich Conrad Dietrich Wyneken was born in 1810 in generally the region known as Hanover in northern Germany, died in 1876 in San Francisco. But he spent most of his career, his ministry as a pastor in the states of Indiana, Maryland, and Missouri, and then finally in Ohio before he kind of retired and went out to his son-in-law and daughter in San Francisco. He's most famous for arriving as a volunteer to serve as a frontier missionary pastor in 1838 and going back to Germany for a few years in the early 1840s to get support for mission work among the isolated, unserved, massive German immigrant population in North America. And he also personally recruited either candidates for the public ministry or other men who were pastors without a calling in Germany to come over, and he said, "You're just sitting around here in Germany for years. There's no future prospects for you here anyway, and at the same time, there are thousands of people who are just begging for a pastor. So the right thing for you to do is to come over if you can." So he is also noted kind of for that networking, which he had on both sides of the Atlantic, and he's really a large behind-the-scenes guy who directly led to the founding of the Missouri Synod in 1847. So it's no surprise he served as the Missouri Synod's president from 1850 to 1864. So right around the time he left his calling in Baltimore, Maryland, to go to Missouri and become the Synod president, he developed his own Spruch book, which is basically a passage book for the Catechism. So I'm sure if any of you are a Lutheran in the audience, the word catechism or Luther Small Catechism is undoubtedly familiar to you. You probably have memorized, hopefully have memorized the 6 chief parts of the Catechism. What a lot of people don't know is, or at least they don't realize at first, at least as a student, that Luther only wrote those 6 parts. It's only a couple dozen pages at most in most catechism textbooks. What often churches do now is publish questions that really go into the finer details of each part of the catechism, into the 10 Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, the sacraments, and they back them up with passages. Well, it's not that Wyneken invented this idea of having Bible passages underneath the questions, but he definitely had a very systematic way of doing it, and it was meant to supplement the small catechism. So this is kind of in the days before they had merged the 2 concepts together in one book of the catechism questions with passages directly underneath. Now we'll get into his Spruch book a little bit more later on in the episode. One quick note before we get into it a little bit deeper is Wyneken's middle name is Conrad Dietrich, and I didn't know this until I had this course I just took, was that Conrad Dietrich is the author of a very famous Lutheran catechism, which the Missouri Synod ended up using for quite a few decades in its earlier history. So it's interesting that his middle name is also the name of a famous catechist. Now, a quote that popped up to me in my earlier studies when I'm going through the Wyneken material was found in a letter that he wrote anonymously originally into Der Lutheraner, the Lutheran publication that was out of Missouri. He was kind of writing to make a point, but he's also reflecting on his childhood. So he quotes his grandmother, and she supposedly said to him, "Stay with the dear Lord Jesus Christ for me, and do not let yourself be turned away from the catechism and the hymns. If you will be a good boy, you'll get the big Bible, and then read it diligently from it, and hold on to it in honor of me." So this idea of holding on to his faith in Jesus, the first thing his grandmother said, don't be turned away from the catechism, but also these hymns that you have learned. So part of his early Christian identity, which was a huge part of his identity as a whole, was connected to the catechism. So a question I had looking at this quote is, well, she didn't really name which specific edition, which catechism is she talking about? So that was part of my studies. Now, the context for this is Wyneken and his family lived in the city of Verden, which is a major city in that northern Hanover area. In fact, there was a dual duchy called Bremen-Verden, obviously Verden being the other half of that, and it was its own political unit. I don't want to say it's the same as like a state is today in the United States, but it was at the same time a bit more important than like a county level. So somewhere between like a national state within the empire and a county. I suppose it was technically literally a county, a principality in the empire, but it had its own autonomy. Let's just put it that way. For a while, the Swedish Empire owned it, and Wyneken's ancestors were public servants, mostly political or military officials in that part of the empire. So Bremen-Verden and the Wyneken family goes back well into the mid-early 1600s. So that was well established by this time. He was part of this Bremen-Verden subculture of northern Germany. Well, why do we care about that? Well, basically, as I said a little bit earlier, is the state-church separation is not existent. So whatever the religious political leader of Bremen-Verden decided, and of course he wasn't a dictator, he had other people giving input, but whatever the the region decided was going to be the catechism. That's what the students, the little children, would have been learning. So I then decided to look at what is Grandma talking about to little Wyneken. We were going to look at the catechisms that were available in Bremen-Verden at this time. So one of the earliest catechisms that had impact and influence came out in 1657 by the general superintendent, so the leader of the church in Bremen-Verden, Michael Havemann. He published a book, basically Fundamental Questions on the Articles of Faith, was the gist of the title of his book. However, as soon as he published it, it faced some heated objections and debates. So he, like I said, he wasn't a dictator. He couldn't just say, here's my catechism, go ahead and use it. The consistory, the pastors, the lay leaders of the church said, we don't like this. Why? Because it had a focus on the theology of the heart. And we don't really have time to get into what all that means, but basically that was an inward focus that Johann Arndt, a famous author of True Christianity, had talked about 50 years earlier in the very early 1600s. Controversial to some degree, but also immensely popular with parts of the population. But within the Lutheran circles, sometimes people really pounced on anyone if they talked about too much inward reflection versus outward objective justification. So anyways, that catechism was produced, but was not popular. There's a different catechism, though, that was a little bit older that replaced the Havemann catechism. That was by a general superintendent named Johann Süttefleisch. He's from the neighboring Duchy of Brunswick. That first appeared around 1603. The general superintendent Süttefleisch, he said, well, this needs to be designed for Lutherans, Christians, young and old, and this reflects the older previous understanding that this catechism is kind of the layperson's Bible. It's meant to be used at home on a regular basis. It's not just a textbook for your elementary school children. It's not just a textbook for that one class that Lutherans have to take before they can be confirmed. It's kind of the center point of Christian life alongside the Bible and regular worship. So Süttefleisch, he developed a catechism based on Luther's small catechism, and he just built on it. He added some simple questions which dissected the text, really delved into it, and it was supported with passages. Basically, if you know enough German and you can find a rare copy of this, it's kind of hard to find, even online, but you look at it, the content, the layout is very similar to catechisms that I grew up with in the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod and other contemporary Lutheran catechisms that have looked like. So I don't want to say he invented that kind of catechism, but it reflects a centuries-old tradition of catechesis. So the way Süttefleisch's catechism arrived in Bremen-Verden, so where Wyneken's family roots were, it came about all by accident. So the Duke of Brunswick invaded Bremen-Verden, and the chaplains with his army brought that catechism along with them, and somehow they had enough contact with the local populace. Maybe they talked with the other clergy members, or maybe they held services that the laity went to. Either way, the Süttefleisch catechism was very impressive to them. It made a good impression on the locals in Bremen-Verden, so they imported it via an invasion, which is an interesting way to think about it. So Lutherans invaded Lutherans, and they shared a catechism at the end. Amazingly, this catechism from 1603 was still noted in the early 19th century, even early 20th century. There's still reports of this. The little Süttefleisch is what they called it. Süttefleisch's small catechism was still used and highly regarded in many areas of northern Germany. So it was almost replaced, though, or at least it officially, technically was replaced. Another general superintendent named Daniel Lütkemann produced instructions for catechism instruction, so kind of how to teach the catechism to other catechists, so pastors, what they're supposed to do. So later, General Superintendent Johann Diekmann said we need to use this Lütkemann's instructions and add it in addition to some others with the Süttefleisch catechism, so kind of a supplement. that went okay. So it kind of emerged two catechisms with some instructions on how to teach it and what to do, which is also built on Luther's catechism. So it kind of morphed into like three catechisms rolled into one by the end of the 1600s. In 1723, another general superintendent, Lucas Bachmeister, said, we're going to use a different catechism, also from the 1600s. He's not making up a new one, but it was written by Justus Gesenius. It was the small catechism questions, based again on Luther's small catechism. So people aren't really inventing the wheel all over again. They're just saying we're going to take our own take on the catechism. This Gesenius catechism was noted for its, quote, zeal for lively faith and better knowledge, end quote. This concept of a lively faith versus just simple knowledge, maybe you pick up on this, is considered pietist by some people. So this catechism, like a previous one, came under attack. So even though this was officially introduced in 1723 to replace the old Süddefleisch catechism, this one got shown the door pretty early on. So Luther's catechism with Süddefleisch was restored to its previous position. So that takes us all the way to the very end of the 1700s. So simple timeline here, 1650-ish, center of the 1650s, all the way till almost 1800. The Süddefleisch catechism is ingrained in the Lutheran population. Generation after generation grew up with this. Undoubtedly, Wyneken's grandmother had the Süddefleisch catechism, and maybe as a little girl she remembered some of the controversies that used to surround trying to replace that catechism. Well, lo and behold, 1792, right in the high water mark of the French Revolution, the Hanover State Catechism was introduced, and then it was also introduced in Bremen-Verden. So by this time, Sweden had lost Bremen-Verden. It was owned by the Elector of Hanover, which, if you really know your European history, also was the King of England at the time. The Georges were all Hanoverians. They've ruled Hanover, and they're known as Hanoverians in England. They lived in England, especially George III. He only spoke well, he probably knew some German, but he was native-born English speaker, never really visited Hanover, unlike his ancestors. Well, anyway, this Hanover State Catechism was introduced by another general superintendent in Bremen-Verden named Velthusen. This catechism, if you're familiar with the late 1700s, you're not going to be surprised by the fact that it's influenced by the Enlightenment. It's a rationalist catechism. It reflected the theological zeitgeist. And Luther's catechism, although it was the foundation or the basis for all those other catechisms that were competing with each other, no more. Luther's catechism was considered too orthodox and too outdated. But people already noted in that very Enlightenment influenced era, there were objections that this new catechism, this state rationalist catechism, was not decisive enough in some of the main teachings of Christianity. Nevertheless, this official state catechism remained in use until 1862, so it had a very long run in Hanover and Bremen-Verden. However, as alluded to earlier, that little Süddefleisch catechism, printed all the way back first in 1603, did not completely disappear. It still remained kind of the underground catechism for many congregations and pastors, and I think that's where we see Wyneken's grandmother. She's not talking about the rationalist catechism. She's saying, hold on to this catechism. Don't let this little Lutheran catechism, the little Süddefleisch catechism, be driven from your heart or mind. So all the evidence, without flat out telling us which catechism it was, all points to the Süddefleisch, and later on we'll see that Wyneken refers to the Süddefleisch catechism when he's an adult as a pastor, so the evidence is pretty strong. That's the one he... But let's talk about that rationalist catechism, the state catechism used in Hanover and also introduced into Bremen-Verden. It was in use for, let's see, that would be 70 plus years before it was removed, so quite a large influence, and a lot of the influential leaders of American Lutheran church bodies, Wyneken among them, came from that Hanover region, so they would have encountered this most likely in some way. Well, we have a first-hand account from a British traveler named Thomas Hodgkin, writing around 1819, 1820, so about exactly the same time that Wyneken was beginning his catechism studies. This is what he says about the religious instruction in the lands of Hanover. He says, Such is the spirit of the two principal elementary books used in Hanover and in Germany to teach that most important of all things for the happiness of man, the proper manner to conduct himself. Okay, so just pause there. He's saying what's most important for mankind, humanity? Well, how to behave, the proper manner to conduct yourself. He continues, these books are used at least for the younger branches of both sexes twice every day and must have a great influence on their character. He goes on to say that in all the schools, something is taught under the name of religion, and this term signifies so many different things that which is taught under this name requires some further explanation. It is that part of the instruction of this country on which the teachers lay the greatest stress. It is united with the severest censure and the warmest praise. They describe it as forming the heart, and much of the Catechism illustrates the duties of life. So Wyneken, later writing under his pen name Hans, he noted his grandmother's reactions to the local rationalist pastor. Whenever he was brought up in conversation, the grandmother would repeat, the more learned, the more perverted. So you might say, well, she's just an anti-intellectual. She doesn't like people with an education. Well, that's certainly what it looks like on face value, and probably not worth arguing with that assessment. However, it was definitely a criticism connected to what this supposedly learned, educated pastor was teaching as far as Christian Lutheran doctrine. She would take the kids over on Sunday over to the Bible, and Wyneken said, quote, she would say, there, see for yourself, here it is completely different. He also noted that she directed Wyneken and his siblings to look directly into Luther's catechism and to refer to Johann Arndt's Wahres Christentum. So two touchstones of true Lutheran doctrine and piety. So this was definitely part of that underground anti-rationalist catechism movement. And based on what Wyneken would say later in life, she was probably raised and influenced by that Süddefleisch catechism and was continuing that education she'd received from there and passing it on to the further generations. So Hodgkins provides a little bit more of illustrations of what's inside this rationalist catechism. He gives us an example of what the instructor would say than what the people would say. So we'll go through a few examples. So the instructor is supposed to ask, the world must have had an author by whom it has been created. Why do you judge so? And the pupil is supposed to respond, the smallest house must have a builder. How then can the world, this great and beautiful dwelling house for innumerable creatures, exist without a wise and powerful author? If anyone's familiar with kind of the deist view of God, of creation, it's kind of reflecting that in a pretty obvious way. He's the great builder, the architect of the world. The other example that's often used, I didn't see it in this catechism though, was he's the clockmaker, right? God creates the world, winds up the clock, and then he steps back and lets things happen. So yeah, he's the designer, he's the architect, but God is not miraculously, spiritually interacting with his creation. So that's implied from these questions. Another example, the instructor says this, can we promote the perfection and felicity of the soul when we take no care of our body? The pupil is to answer, no, God has so united soul and body that through a careful attention to the body, the perfection and felicity of the soul is promoted. Okay, so not really dividing spiritual things from physical things at all. In fact, it's saying you take care of your body, you can actually perfect your soul. So this is way off base from genuine biblical Lutheran doctrine as far as sin, redemption, justification, basically anything. That once you get below the surface of what's part of the Lutheran faith, this has clearly gone away from that as far as the soul is concerned. Another book that Hodgkins referenced was called The Children's Friend, Der Kinderfreund, and this book came out in many editions as well. And this one is more kind of like a parable, fable kind of form of instruction. I have a couple pictures of the title covers of these books. One of them has a nice picture of an elephant on it. It's meant to be appealing to children. Oh yes, let's read from this fun kind of storybook, but there's always a moral lesson to it. So here's one example from The Children's Friend. A mother was once going on a small country excursion. The journey was not long, but she had to pass through a few villages. Her little daughter, Regina, was with her. In the first village, the road was narrow and dirty. Mother and daughter wore shoes and stockings, which they did not wish to soil. The mother could pass without much dirtying herself, but she was unable to do this and carry over the child. Near at hand was a maiden keeping cows. As soon as she saw the travelers, she ran to them, took little Regina in her arms, and carried her safe into the dry. Question: do you not think that this action was worth friendly thanks? End quote. So, kind of a boring story, if you ask me, not that entertaining, but it's kind of setting up a situation with a practical application. This maiden helped this little girl get through the mud without getting dirty. Really simple, basic stuff. I don't think this falls into the sin or no sin category of morality by any means. But the point is basically you should say thank you if someone helps you. And that's the kind of lessons this Children's Friend, this book had. So at the end of the day, the kids were supposed to learn good manners. And this is what was under, as Hodgkins pointed out, that general term of religious instruction. So young Wyneken wanted nothing more than to listen to his grandmother, but following his grandmother's admonitions to stay true to the Bible and Luther's catechism did not come without difficulty and pain. He recalled his experience in his town's education system. He said, quote, "When the schoolmaster wanted to make a learned person out of me and wanted to teach me all kinds of muddled stuff, I could not and did not want to learn anything. The schoolmaster was nasty. He took his rod and said, a priori will not work with Fritz. I must try a posteriori. What that was supposed to mean I could not say, but I could feel it very well, because then followed rather hard blows in my back, and I was always called Dumb Fritz." That's a joke I think he's putting in there, some posteriori kind of education on his backside. Now he continued his account. He said, "Hans, my blessed grandmother used to say," and this is his pen name, Hans, or Fritz, he was probably called, "when I returned with a blue back, slinking up to the ground and putting my head all red from crying and being very upset in her lap. Don't be like that. Look, if the dear Lord would have wanted to spare you, it would have been an easy thing for him. He could have spared you, too, those odd things which one is taught in the school, of which in my time, thank God, I heard nothing. You can learn as well as the others, but it's so much better, my child, believe me. You see, if you take good note of the fact that you always keep the little mind that you have in good health, you'll get through it. A good manager uses what he has." So, Wyneken continued. He said, "I've taken notice of that, and since I knew no better place where to keep my little mind together, I have it all in Luther's small catechism, God's dear word, and stuck in several other old books. And then, thank God, I have come through thus far to end my days with him." So Hodgkins also gives us a bit of a description of the confirmation process. So for those of you familiar with catechesis, the students are instructed. It varies 4 to maybe just 1 year of catechism instruction. I had 4. A lot of people I know had 4 or at least 2 from their pastor. But then it led up to this confirmation, so this public profession of faith and acceptance into at least young adult membership in the congregation. Obviously, for Lutherans, this is when we start having our first communion, is all wrapped up in the same experience. But Hodgkin also describes the examination process, which is still practiced. This is what I had growing up. This is how we do it in my congregation. I'm sure many of our audience members also experienced and continue to witness the examination process. So Hodgkin gives us a bit of a historical anecdote from his observations in the early 1800s, and I thought it was really interesting to make some comparisons maybe you can make on your own between what you see today. So this is what he says, quote, "Previous to being confirmed, the children are instructed by the clergyman during several weeks. and even the young girls are publicly examined in the church, that they may testify their fitness to be admitted members of the congregation. This public examination and the confirmation are very trying and seem to be thought very momentous by the children. They are collected in the body of the church, totally separate from the rest of the assembly. Those whom I saw were dressed in black. The girls wore white shawls and had flowers in their bosoms. The little things trembled and cried through the whole 2 hours which the ceremony lasted. They were, for the whole of this time, the exclusive objects of attention. The clergyman prayed for them, he preached to them, he questioned them, and called on them to testify their faith aloud. And when they had done this, they were led to the altar and allowed to commune, for the first time in their lives. The ceremony seemed impressive. The clergyman, the congregation, and the children all wept. The latter, indeed, seemed to suffer much. It was a sort of tragedy in which all were actors. This, quote, painful solemnity, unquote, I was told, made, quote, a more powerful impression, unquote. And I was not a little surprised to learn from several young women that they remembered the day on which they were confirmed as one of the sweetest of their lives. So one wonders if Wyneken's confirmation had as deep of an emotional impact on him as Hodgkin had described for others. On the other hand, Wyneken's memory of his catechism cannot be doubted. With firm resolve and unshakable conviction, he asserted that they could not take the catechism and the hymns from my head and from my heart. So after his confirmation, Wyneken shortly thereafter began his studies at the universities of Göttingen and later Halle. He studied theology with the intent of becoming a pastor. So at the end of his university career, a theology student needed to pass a further examination before a commission or a group from the church consistory. So he was examined on several things, among them preaching, but of course also can he teach catechism. So Hodgkin also describes the setup of some of these teaching seminaries in Hanover. I'm not sure if Wyneken was part of this exact system. Wouldn't be surprised if this was his experience. So Hodgkin describes, one practice which is very good is the manner adopted of making each of them, these future teachers, pastors, in turn play the master's part with the others. One of the lessons selected for this is religious instruction, which, as it is a sort of catechism, necessarily demands a great attention to the use of words and great accuracy of thought. Each one in his turn has to teach, or rather question the others. He gives to the inspector the night before an abstract of the questions he means to ask and informs him of the part of the catechism he proposes to talk about and explain, and the manner in which he intends to explain and enforce it. This allows the inspector to know beforehand what faults he is likely to commit. The whole of both classes assemble in the presence of the inspector, and the young man whose turn it is begins catechizing, and when he is finished he sits down and is informed by the inspector in the presence of the whole group in which he has erred, either in his manner or his matter, and thus the whole, by questioning, teach one another, and from the lecture of the superior, which is well given, each profit from the excellencies so well as by the faults of all. So basically, they practice teach in front of each other, and it gets critiqued in public, and people learn in this method. So maybe nothing too remarkable to say there any further. So a couple notes on Wyneken's life to get him over to America. He was ordained on May 8th in 1837 in the city of Stade. And then 1 year later, 1838, he travels to America. His daughter recalled writing in 1940, so 100 years after the fact, but she said this: my father heard of the German Lutherans in America whose knowledge and education along spiritual lines was pitifully lacking. This caused within his heart a burning desire to migrate to America voluntarily to settle among this group and to bring them the true and pure gospel. So large motivation for Wyneken obviously would be to give them the saving gospel, to give people the words of eternal life by connecting them with Jesus. But the primary impulse, I suppose, that got him over there was that he heard that they were lacking Christian education. They were lacking someone to teach them the catechism and to preach to them. So one of the reports that he read came from an American Lutheran pastor named Ezra Keller. He traveled in the mid-1830s, and he described what he saw in the upper Midwest states of today. He said, they have no one, these German Lutherans, or just Lutherans in general, they have no one to break unto them the bread of life. They are exceedingly desirous to have a minister who would preach and catechize their children. So, 1838, Wyneken arrives in Baltimore. After a few weeks, he gets connected with the Pennsylvania Lutheran Synod's Missionary Society, and they send him out west to basically do Ezra Keller's old job and go through several states, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and I think even to Missouri. Well, he doesn't even get out of Ohio before he starts preaching to people, so not even in the zone of his assignment, and he gets barely across the border into Indiana, and he can't get much farther. He says there's so many people who need him to stay long-term right where he is already. So he begins to become the pastor of two congregations close by, one in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and one to the southeast in Friedheim. So in one of his letters home, he describes his catechism experience. So when he's in Fort Wayne, he stays in the postmaster's house. Henry Rudisil, a local leader and founder at both of the town and the congregation, but they have to do catechism outside because his room is too small. If the weather's bad, then they have to knock on neighbors' doors just to continue class. In Friedheim, this is the country, rural German, more of an immigrant community than the Fort Wayne congregation, was a bit more mixed. Out in Friedheim, he uses a little log cabin, which is his home, the church, and the schoolhouse, all in one. He writes to his mother describing exactly his schedule. He would say, in addition to teaching catechism and Sunday school, he also required adults who wanted to become members to have special instruction. So catechesis was not just a thing for the kids, it was for all ages. He recorded that he preached at least 3 times a week, sometimes up to 6, and a lot of that would be not in those 2 towns, but out in other settlements. He visited 5 different teaching stations, 5 schools. He held catechism class in 2 locations, and he spent the rest of his time visiting with families. So we have a little insight into the spiritual education levels of the people in Friedheim from Wilhelm Seeler, the pastor who filled Wyneken's position once he left Fort Wayne to take up his post in Baltimore. Wilhelm Seeler noted that his members from Westphalia, quote, knew nothing about the fact that they had belonged to the Union State Church of Prussia, but they all considered themselves to be good Lutherans because the small Lutheran catechism remained in constant use by their congregations. So this is an observation about the self-identity of these German Lutheran immigrants. While many of the theologians and the higher-ups got involved in church politics, there was huge concern about the Prussian Union, where the King of Prussia was forcing the Reformed and the Lutherans to be under one unified body. The local villagers, and at least in this one town in Prussia before they immigrated, weren't even aware that they were merged with the Reformed branch of Protestantism. They said, we got Luther's small catechism, we must have always been Lutherans. So very interesting that the laity, as well as the clergy, viewed the catechism as this mark of identity and doctrine. So I'll read now an excerpt from one of Wyneken's letters to his mother. He wrote, quote, concerning my confirmands, I have joy in 3 awakened girls. The Lord works in their souls, and so much as I can judge their essence, 2 of them have found the Lord, and the 3rd searches for him. The latter of the girls couldn't spell when I arrived here. She knew nothing of the Lord. But the crucified love of the Lord, how I hope, is making a deeper and believing impression on her. A marvelous work appears to be proceeding in this simple, quiet, and humble soul. If only I don't hinder his work with my coldness and clumsiness. The former 2 girls, I believe, also have joy and peace in the Lord. I am at a loss how the Lord has fully touched both of them. He also adds, to his mother, I found Süddefleisch's Fragen, so that Süddefleisch catechism very suitable for children and for me. It likes to make well my stupidity. If you know of Luther's small catechism with cited passages beneath, that's what I prefer, if the catechism must remain unaltered. So he's asking for resources, not just from his mother, but through his extensive network of friends and family in Germany. He says, send me copies of Siddefleisch's Fragen. So remember, this is from 1603. It was the first edition. It's being reprinted now. But he also wants Luther's Catechism. But he wants passages. He wants proof passages, which Luther's Catechism, it does include references to passages. Luther would sometimes have the questions asked, where is this written? Then he would give a citation and a paraphrase or a quote from the scriptures. But what Wyneken is almost certainly asking for is what is found in Siddefleisch's Catechism and things like the Reformed Heidelberg Catechism, where there's just lists of passages backing up the truths, the doctrines that are being taught. In my Wisconsin Synod experience, this is what all of our catechisms have looked like for decades. You have questions and answers that go deeper than Luther's small catechism, and they're always proof passages underneath. So Wyneken is looking for varieties that would fill those needs exactly. So according to family tradition, Wyneken gave one of his students named Sophie Book, a notebook at her confirmation in which he copied several psalms. A year later, in 1841, the couple was married by a local pastor, another Lutheran pastor. So Friedrich Wyneken was 31, and Sophie would turn 18 just a few months later. So while many Germans clung to their social and class distinctions when they immigrated to America, Wyneken had no problems about marrying a pious farmer's daughter and a former catechism student. In 1845, after several years back in Germany recruiting more pastors and ministers, Wyneken went back to Fort Wayne and then took a call to Baltimore to a Lutheran congregation. He said one of the conditions for accepting the call there, he says, okay, I don't know what you guys are used to as far as Lutheran teaching and practice. Wyneken was aware that especially in the eastern part of the United States, this so-called American Lutheranism was kind of lax on some teachings, especially regarding the sacraments. A lot of them were being very ecumenical in the sense that they were downplaying any differences found in the Augsburg Confession and so on. So he says, okay, if I'm going to come, I'm going to be a rather confessional guy, and I'm going to preach and teach this way. They said, no, we're Lutheran, come on over. That's exactly what we're looking for. Unfortunately, pretty much the first Sunday he was there, or shortly thereafter, Wyneken discovered unionistic practices, and he saw this in the preparation of the Lord's Supper. So Wyneken was surprised to see that the elements for the Lord's Supper were laid out with wine in an earthen jug and bread in the entire loaf. And maybe that doesn't stand out to people, but that practice was definitely a Reformed influence, whereas Lutherans emphasize this is Christ's body, this is Christ's blood given for you for the forgiveness of sins. Some practices use the whole loaf of bread and they break it just as Jesus broke bread, but they emphasize the breaking to say this symbolizes Jesus dying on the cross. All of this is symbolism. We're only meant to remember what Jesus did on the cross, and this is all that's going on here. So two very different things being emphasized and effectively being taught with communion. So Wyneken later discovered, oh, there are a bunch of people who really identify as Reformed, but they're just happy to be in a German Protestant congregation. So it causes a bit of a problem, right? Wyneken says, I'm going to be Lutheran. You guys seem to have deceived me. At least that's how I feel. I might as well leave, though. I don't want to cause turmoil in his congregation. But they felt that they still wanted to have him as a pastor. So he said this, well, then I will take the Lutheran and Heidelberg catechisms, the Reformed Catechism, with me up to the pulpit and read and explain both of them starting next Sunday. Then each one can see for himself on which side the full truth of the divine word is found. So he decided to dual wield catechisms. He's going to have the Lutheran one and the Reformed one and make a comparison. And obviously his point was to show that the Lutheran catechism was the biblical one. One of the members named Alexander Einvector said this, well, since the Reformed found fault with the teachings on Holy Communion, they went away except for a few who recognized the truth and remained. So Wyneken was not above holding to the truth as taught in the Catechism, even if it meant dividing his congregation and losing members over it. So Wyneken had the habit of using the Catechism in daily conversation. If people are having trouble, he was reported of saying this, quote, Instead of gaping about in the street, stick your nose into the catechism, for you don't know it yet. Surprisingly, Wyneken could walk up to people, say those kinds of things, and people in general didn't hold it against him. Apparently, he was very warm and loving as he said these things, but his encouragement to people was to know and learn their catechism. So, that being understood, that Wyneken identified himself with the catechism, grew up with the catechism, came to America to teach people who didn't know the catechism, and then use the catechism to shape not only his own but his own members' identity. No surprise at all that he would be involved in producing some kind of catechetical resource. So the first time that he actually prints something, and it's really the only time he does something formally like this, is done at the request of the Missouri Synod. So the Missouri Synod, today called the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, at that time the German Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Missouri, Ohio, and other states, was founded in 1847. This was while Wyneken was in Baltimore. He was still working at that time at getting his congregation to be, I suppose, for lack of a better phrase, thoroughly Lutheran, making sure they knew what Lutheran doctrine was and what it meant, ironing out any of those areas of unclarity. So they did not join the Missouri Synod that first year. They did join the next year in 1848, and in the following year, 1849, the Synod requests that Wyneken produce a Spruchbuch, which is German for a passage book, as a supplement to Luther's Small Catechism. So the idea is we want to have a book for our Synod to use to help teach Luther's Small Catechism. So what Wyneken did was basically go through the 6 chief parts, 5 parts, depending on how you count them, of the Luther's Small Catechism, and then extrapolate the various teaching points from the catechism, and then give proof passages. So the balance for the Spruchbuch is interesting. If you look at Luther's Catechism today, you might see, okay, their large segments cover the 10 Commandments, and the Creed is a big section, and but each seems to have roughly equal share, at least as page space is concerned. Wyneken's Catechism, or at least the Spruchbuch for the Catechism, had about 20% passages covering the teachings, the doctrines of the 10 Commandments, and then a whopping 56% covering the Apostles' Creed alone. So a lot of this was talking about the divine attributes of God, things that aren't clearly laid out in the Catechism in great detail, things like the God being omnipresent, omniscient, and things like that. Also into the 2 natures of Jesus. Now those are obviously present in the Creed, but they're not explicitly explained in any great length or detail. Well, Wyneken really teases those points out with the various passages that he cites. Now I would have expected that he would have bigger sections on maybe things like communion, because that was a point of contention between him and some of his former members in Baltimore. But communion, baptism too, is something that caused some division among what it actually meant among American Lutherans. Those get the smallest percentages, and I suppose that's just because the Bible probably has fewer passages about them. But those are only 2% for communion and 4% for baptism. Now, at first glance, if you pick up a copy of Wyneken's Spruchbuch, it may seem that either the review committee didn't do its job like they said they were going to, or the printer was a little careless. Modern editor might complain about some partial passage references, or at least some inconsistency. So sometimes a single verse would be referenced, John 3:16, but then other parts of other passages would be included. It's like, oh, maybe he referenced all the way through John 3:18. Other times the opposite happened, where several verses are referenced, but only one printed in the text. It's perhaps thought that Wyneken would only use part of the passages that proved the doctrinal point. He wasn't going to just print everything. Another issue for a modern reader is the inconsistency given for abbreviations or even different spellings for the books of the Bible. These are pretty minor stuff, though. In an age where abbreviations were not standard, I guess it couldn't be expected. For example, you see the same things happen in the abbreviations for states. That wasn't standardized until many decades later. Overall, though, there's a lack of spelling or of other obvious errors in the text. and the other editions have no alterations. So I guess you could say that the printer was faithful in copying Wyneken's manuscript. Now, there are maybe some difficulties from the instructor's point of view. There are no questions and no answers in the Spruik book. It's literally an outline of parts of the Catechism. Here's the first commandment. Here are a bunch of passages that somehow relate to the first commandment. So the instructor is obviously going to need to know what specific teaching point should be made from each passage, or at least each group of passage. It's rather unclear exactly in how this book is to be employed or used. What's the methodology? Someone who's experienced, who's taught catechism for a while, especially very familiar with Luther's catechism, no doubt would find things to say. But if you're a first-year pastor, first time using this book, I can definitely see how this maybe caused some frustration. As noted in his letter to his mother a few years before, Wyneken obviously desired a catechism with proof passages. So he found this as a strength to back up the doctrines being taught. The strengths are may be a little obvious. So if you're going to argue with anything being taught in this catechism, you're going to end up only arguing against Scripture itself. The applications that we see in this catechism, they're applicable for all kinds of situations that might be encountered with other denominations in the United States. Passages that counteract some of the influences of the revivals, Methodism, Calvinism, Roman Catholicism, even Freemasonry. These are the issues Wyneken had to deal with, and these passages would help other people deal with those issues as well. So this is an excellent book for anyone trying to figure out exactly what does the Bible say about specific topics. So while the cons of this book, the weaknesses of this book might be that it doesn't have a very formal, rigid way to apply it, the flip side is that the strength is you can apply it in many other ways. So while his Spruik book, his passage book, is one of the lesser known and less significant of Wyneken's writings, it is part of the story of a lifelong student and teacher of the Catechism, and helps us understand one of the many transatlantic transformations with which the Lutheran Church was forced to reckon. From 1850 to 1864, Wyneken served as the president of the Missouri Synod, and part of his responsibilities in that position was to oversee the education system. By the 1854 convention, there was a desire to have a different standard catechism, kind of an all-in-one catechism textbook for use. So Wyneken suggested what he called the Excellent Catechism by Conrad Dietrich, and this catechism would see use for many decades. C.F.W. Walther was the one who suggested printing an edited version, and it was his project to come up with that, and he presented an edition to the Synod in 1857, which was adopted the next year. Part of Wyneken's impact as a president was shaping the identity, the mission of the Missouri Synod, what it would be. It was only in its first few years when he undertook the role of president. So he wanted to see a growing church, but one that was strengthened by the doctrine of the Lutheran Church. And this is what he said at the 1857 convention. Quote, "If we want to be intentional about having properly founded congregations, then one must be in accordance with the image of Luther and the Lutheran Church, especially in its flourishing state, with true earnestness and precise carefulness amidst pleas and sighings to him who grants the flourishing. See that the catechism be promoted." As he inspected and directed the Synod, Wyneken continued to emphasize the importance of catechesis. In 1860, he remarked, quote, "Noticing that catechism instruction at many places was well carried out in churches was especially important and gratifying to me, and to note that attendance was generally good. In some places, the examination displayed local difficulties. Sometimes the laziness of the congregation is to blame, sometimes the courage of the preacher." End quote. While these official reports offer some insight into how Wyneken led the Synod to uphold the Catechism, what cannot be adequately assessed are the countless personal visits and talks with other pastors and teachers. The final thing we'll discuss with Wyneken and the Catechism is his mark as a teacher. Now, this was noted earlier already that he was really invested in not only the head knowledge, the factual knowledge of his students, is noted in his letter to his mother from the early 1840s, but he continued to impact further generations of members and even future leaders of the church. One recollection mentioned Wyneken especially. That was from Friedrich Benti, who was a leader in the Missouri Synod at the turn of the 20th century. He also was an author, maybe perhaps most famously known for his introductions to the Book of Concord. Benti recalled that, quote, Wyneken made me understand the Catechism, and from that day on, I was a critic according to a firm principle. So in other words, that's exactly what Wyneken did to help Benti become the person he was going to be. This is how he was going to be a critic, how he was going to analyze different things that was coming his way. Now, we also have some recollections from Wyneken's, one of his youngest children named Emma, and this was taking place in the 1870s, just the last year of his ministry before he went off to California, and he died before he came back. She noted in her memories of the Wyneken household, quote, that Father taught, instructed, and informed. And she added that every Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock, Father conducted Christenlehre, or Christian education, for the entire congregation, adults and children, and the last confirmation class always being seated directly behind the school children. Usually the Christenlehre was preceded by baptisms, end quote. Emma also recalled, quote, when I reached the age of 13, my father gave me 1 year's instruction for confirmation. Then, owing to ill health, he was sent to California in October 1875. My brother-in-law, Reverend Heinrich Kramer of Zanesville, confirmed me after another year's instruction by him. I wanted my parents to come home for my confirmation, but these plans did not materialize. One day I went to my brother Gustav crying bitterly. I told him how homesick I was for our parents. He consoled me. Then I was content and happy. But lo, when May 4th came, my dear father passed away suddenly that morning of a heart attack in San Francisco. So instead of coming to his earthly home for his birthday, he went to his eternal home. I never saw my father again, not even after his death. So in conclusion, we can say that from his earliest memories to his final legacy, Wyneken's life story can be told in connection. We note that the story of 19th century catechesis on both sides of the Atlantic is portrayed in part through the experiences and teachings of Wyneken. We also note the impact of catechesis on those who would immigrate, Wyneken and his family and friends in particular. The Catechism was both a reason to go to serve the fellow Lutherans in North America, but it was also the greatest desire among many of the Lutherans in the United States that they need to have pastors, they need to have synods, they needed to have seminaries so that they and their children would be catechized. We also note in Wyneken's life the repeated habit of teaching both children and adults. We see that the pattern of catechesis was not simply the 2 years at an elementary or middle school level, and then it was a graduation ceremony with confirmation. I know it was something that was continued throughout the life of these Lutheran people. We also see that there was a clear need to form individual character as well as a congregational culture around catechesis, confirmation, as well as public examination. We also note the transition of the state church catechisms to synodical catechisms, and that was something that every immigrant group in the 19th century had to wrestle with. Which catechism were they going to use? Were they going to copy their native land's catechism? Perhaps some of those were not good candidates based on the thought or the mindset behind them, and others were used from centuries and centuries before. It's not really until the turn of the 20th century that we see original catechisms being produced by some of these immigrant groups, even though they had been on the continent for a good 75 years by that time. And more specifically, we see through Wyneken's story the place of the Catechism in the Missouri Synod itself and in its mission and identity.